Thank you. Thank you for coming this evening. Welcome to the Roosevelt House, where Franklin and Eleanor lived before moving to the White House, and where many of FDR's New Deal ideas were hatched. Welcome to the CUNY Institute for Education Policy, founded by David Steiner, the Dean of Hunter College of Education and former Commissioner of Education for New York State. The CUNY Institute is dedicated to clear judgment, innovative ideas, and pragmatic solutions to education challenges. I'm Peter MEYER, Program Director of the Institute, and honored to be part of this exciting new endeavor. This is our 9th public event in a whirlwind year, and it is also an honor to have a guest tonight, Joel Klein, who was one of the longest-serving chancellors of New York City schools, a man education journalist John Merrill called the most influential educator in America. As we await a new administration in New York, and in particular the appointment of the next Schools Chancellor, it seems like the best possible moment to review what has and has not been achieved under the current regime in the ongoing challenge of providing a high-quality education to every child in New York City. One quick housekeeping note before Joel and David take the stage. You should all have 3x5 cards on your seat. If you have questions for Mr. Klein, we'd ask you to write them legibly on the cards and pass them to the side aisle. And since we assume David will be asking many questions you might consider posing yourself during the next 35 minutes, I ask that you wait until David gives the signal before filling your cards out, and we will collect them at the side aisles. Thank you again for coming tonight, and without further ado, I'll turn the program over to David Steiner.
Thank you so much, Peter, and thank you, everybody. This has to be the coldest day of the year, and your passion for education is duly noted, and each of your names has been duly taken. Let me begin by thanking Joel. This is a moment of transition. We're told the new chancellor will be named on Monday. There is a certain amount of scuttlebutt, which we will not engage in, but suffice to say it's a changing of the guard, to use a British expression. And what better moment, as Peter said, to look back on a really remarkable period of education reform in the nation's largest urban school district, largest school district. The amazing thing about these last years is I think if you had begun to talk about them at the start, it would have been almost inconceivable to think that today we would be sitting where we are and holding up New York City in many regards as a model of reform in the nation, given the sheer scale, the size of the challenge, the results that were upon us. And yet, at the same time, a paradox, which I want to start with. Let us pause it for a moment, and we'll get back into the weeds very shortly as we're joined by Commissioner Cerf from New Jersey and a close colleague, of course, of Joel's. Let's pause it, if we may, Joel, that the numbers are almost all terrific. Let's just for the moment suggest that whether it's dropout rates, whether it's graduation rates, whether it's comparative scores to the rest of the state, we're looking at wonderfully strong indices. How do you square that with the recent opinion polls of 2013, but also 2012, where a plurality of the citizens of New York, at least under these polls, are at best lukewarm, and actually in some cases in these polls, a majority of them claim rather extraordinarily that things have gotten worse. How do we sense, and as you think about that duality of all of these numbers rising, and yet of the reaction that these polls are posing? What's going on?
So I'm not going to avoid your question, although I'd like to. But I will start by, first of all, thanking you and thanking you for your service to the state and for this evening. There's so many people in this room who were both within and on the outside, partners in what we did. And it's really a wonderful time for me to look around and see people that were really part of this journey. When you Brits say changing the guard, you spell that G-U-A-R-D, right? Yeah. So just so we're clear about that. Here's what I think, and I think there's a couple of things. First of all, lots that happened was noisy. And noisy things, people don't get caught up in the numbers. There's no emotional appeal to a 20% increase in graduation rates. It may affect the lives of 15,000 kids each year, but it's not something that grabs you. On the other hand, when you get into issues like closing down a school, issues like co-location, where some of my, one of the rules you learn early in politics, David, is you look for win-wins. And when you do things that are not win-wins, like sharing space, which is absolutely essential, we can get into that, then I think that causes noise. Noise causes discord and leads people who don't, like the people in this room or you or me, they don't follow this in a detail. What they hear is this was discordant, this was noisy, and therefore it must have been problematical. Now, I do think all of that, and I've looked over the years at our numbers. I mean, when I left the chancellorship, by about 11%, the city said that in a poll that they took, the city said basically I had a positive chancellorship. I think it was 46 to 35, not definitive, et cetera. But I do think the hardest piece of it, and I don't blame you for it because I think it was the right move, was in the last move was realigning the tests. And all of a sudden, a city in which people thought 65, 70% of the people, people woke up and all of a sudden my kid is no longer proficient. And lots of kids in the city are not proficient, 26% in reading, 30% in math. And so that, that takes, as we say, some splaining. Yeah. And you don't have a lot of time in these kind of things to splain. So I think that's a large part of what happened.
Let me follow up, and many of you may not know this, but the Chancellor and I had a difficult conversation when Meryl and I moved those scores up, and of course more recently John and Meryl and the board have done so again, and all of you are aware of the even stronger pushback. Do you think that this is ultimately the right thing to do? Is it moving too quickly? Is it threatening the reforms?
I think it is the right thing to do, and I think it's past due for us to get serious about teaching kids the kind of things they're going to need to be successful when they leave high school. A high school degree today, while it's nice to increase the rates, is by no means something to be, the be-all and end-all. Second of all, we can't sustain a world in which 6 out of 10 kids or 5 out of 10 kids going to college have to be remediated before. I mean, it's just, it's a losing hand to play. And in the end, doing it gradually, meaning if you did it this way, that way. Right. Now, what I didn't like the first time, and I wasn't directly involved in the second time, is I didn't feel there was adequate explanation that people understood. So it's one thing to say, well, it's 60% proficient, now it's 40% proficient. And for people to understand, that's not because 60 was wrong at the time. It's because 40 is when you have new and different standards and challenges and stuff like that. And I always felt that some of this was just the politics of it. It did, the mayor had run very successfully in 2009 on some very big gains that we had. And so then it became all of a sudden, well, and the press kept saying, so, well, the mayor exaggerated the gains, but those were the gains that the state, which set the cut scores and the benchmarks and everything, had fed us. So I don't want to look backward. Looking forward, I do think we need to do two critical things. I think we've got to get our students college and career ready. Mm-hmm. I think, these PISA tests are not very encouraging for us. And second of all, we're not going to do that unless we get both the kind of curriculum that will get our kids where we need and the teachers working with that curriculum. So to me, we might as well move this agenda quickly rather than slowly.
I remember calling the commissioner in Tennessee when we got raised to the top, because they'd gotten it first, and said, what would you have done differently in the last 6 months? And he said, communication, communication, communication.
Yeah.
One of the pushbacks around the kind of lukewarm public reactions to the reforms has been that somehow you didn't reach the parents en masse in a way that made them feel included in the reforms, and that their feeling was that when those committees met, that they were appointed, of course, by the mayor, and they were not inclusive, and somehow the parents felt excluded from the reform. You've addressed this before.
I think, first of all, I certainly could have done a better job at communication, although I remember once we had a meeting with somebody, and they were, we don't communicate. So the mayor said, well, look, give them a meeting, sit down. We sat down for 3 hours. They told me exactly what they thought, and I said, I really understand you. I even understand where you're coming from. I just disagree. And she said, you don't listen. I said, no, I listen. I said, I just disagree. She said, we don't want people who listen. We want people who hear us. And so I'm a little skeptical of this. Look, tough things go on. I bet you this whole numbers thing would have looked very different if, in fact, the scores this year had gone up 8 or 9 points. I mean, remember, we ran twice, in 2005, 2009, when the scores were going up. And in both of those cases, and it was polled and we tested it and so forth. So I think we need to be a little careful. Machiavelli, and I realize he's out of vogue these days, but that's not because he's not unimportant. And he had a basic, Chris used to quote this all the time, is, every status quo has a lot of homeowners. These things don't grow up indigenously. They grow up favoring lots and lots of interests. And so when you come along and you say, well, look, here's what we're going to do. We're going to blow this damn thing up, and we're going to do stuff that's very, very different. So all the people who own a piece of the rock, they're saying, this won't be good for me, and they're right. The politicians who used to be able to game the system, Jim Saylor and I were just talking about it, worked with me many years ago in the department, a really talented researcher. Politicians used to be able to game the system so that your kid could get a seat at PS9 and my kid couldn't get a seat. That doesn't happen anymore. If it happens, it's a very rare event. Now, those people understood when we eliminated what they used to call constituent services, that wasn't going to be good for them. When the union sees that we're going to try to really hold people to account, they understand the significance of that. When communities learn that we may close down schools, which serve lots of functions other than educate kids, they get that. So, and then what you're telling them is, hop on my back, and there'll be a bright future out there. And as Machiavelli explained, that's a hard message to make. The other thing that's very hard in politics, and I've thought a lot about this, is how do you at the same time say to people, give them hope while you're knocking the status quo? It's a very difficult political move. It's much easier in one sense to say, things are great. People like Klein and Steiner and these people who knock what's going on, they're just wrong. In fact, your kid's getting a great education. And the fact that Steiner says he's not, or John King says that he's not proficient, that's because he's an idiot and he said the thing wrong. I'd much rather hear that if I'm a parent, that my kid is in fact proficient, rather than need of further education. So I think we need to be a little careful. It's always nice to say, if only I communicated better. Some things are difficult to communicate because they're painful to transition. And, I always think about people communicate awfully well on gun control. And yet today in the New York Times, since last year, 70 out of 109 bills passed in America have gone in the wrong direction. So it's not a lack of communication that happened.
We'll come back one last time, but let's dig in just for a moment to the gold standard, so-called the NAEP results,
Right.
Because as you know, this is where, there's been pushback.
Right.
And in particular, I think between 2009, 2011, and particular 8th grade, where things seem to flatten out, the New York City results have not yet been announced for 2013. We're waiting for them any day now. The states were pretty flat. And statistically, it would be unusual for the city to be way out of line either way from the state. But are you looking to the 2013 the Tudor statistics take the city and treat it as a state, and so we're waiting for the NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress. The argument here being that if the gains were really dramatic until about 2009, and now since 2009 to 13 are essentially flat, then there's a problem.
So it's a couple things. First of all,
Okay.
I think people got to really sort of get the game defined well. So New York State this year went up 8 points in 4 NAEPs. That's more than it's gone up in the whole time as a state that I've been here. Now, compared to Tennessee and D.C., which went up 20 points, which is wholly unprecedented. 8 points used to be a lot of points to go up on the NAEP. Second of all, whether you look at it from the beginning to now, any way you want to slice it, New York City so outperformed the rest of New York State on the NAEP, it's amazing. Over the course of my years, from 2002 to 2011 NAEPs, if you look at those NAEPs, New York City went up in 3 out of the 4 significantly, and 2 in the lower grades went up a full grade, and the state of New York was actually flat and negative. And one of the submissions I've always made is, and it's my mistake, but by following New York State standards, which I think you and I would agree right from the beginning were way too weak, we paid a price. But New York City, while I wouldn't say our results were stellar, our results were certainly solid. In 8th grade math, we got 6 points gain, which is half a year's worth of learning. And the 4th in English and math, we got a year. Now, the other thing I think that people need to take into account in this kind of thing is that if you look at things in a perspective of any given year, so you say, well, from 2011, they went down a couple of points here. I mean, those are rounding errors in NAEP. Jim Campbell explained this a lot better than I am. But, you know, what used to drive me nuts, if you went up 3 points, it was considered significant, and the New York Times gave you a big story. If you went up 2 points, it was not considered significant. One year I went up 3 points, and that wasn't considered significant, and another city went up 2 points, but because they had a larger population, that was, I mean, so 1 year, 2 years, I wouldn't get too bent out of shape. And we'll see what the tutor is, but I actually thought New York State had its best year since I've been following it, and I actually was going to come tonight and say, until you ask such a tough question, that's because of your leadership, and the fact that you started to get tough about curriculum.
So it wasn't that great a leadership because the state results, I mean, just to be completely accurate, the New York State results, 2011 to 13, up 2 points 4th grade math, 2 points 8th grade math, 2 points 4th grade math, and 0 points 8th grade reading.
So it's not 8, it's 6 points.
And we have to disaggregate by subject.
No, but I think you got it. I don't think you rounded. I think you rounded. I think if you look, maybe it's 6 points, 6 points. Maybe is that what it is? 6 points, 6 points. All right, so 6 points. When's the last time New York State went up by 6 points, 6 points?
I mean, and none of them are, as you would have guessed, none of them are statistically significant.
Yeah, no, but
so I guess
if you went down 6 points,
it wouldn't be either.
You'd be 12-point swing. This is what really annoys me. I mean, all other things. I just remember this time and again. If in a poll between 2 people, and you're at 47 and the other guy's at 44, and it's not statistically significant, which one would you rather be?
Agree. Let me just say that I think my guess, and I may be wrong, of course, is that people will look at the 2013 New York City NAEP results, and they will say, look, from 2009 to 2013, here's the record. And
I assume they
that
will. Well, let's see what they are.
All right, that's an invitation from the Chancellor. The question of the charter schools, the co-location, is obviously on everyone's mind because the new mayor has publicly announced a different point of view. Mm-hmm. Focusing not only on the charter schools, but on the general record, what you did, what would you say worries you the most in terms of losing an element of that reform as you look forward? Is it the charter schools? Is it something else? What makes you nervous as you look back on the things that you think made a really big difference and you look forward?
I would not say it's any particular single thing. The charter schools do worry me and worry me profoundly. I mean, there's one statistic that's irrefutable and ought to bother everybody, which is 70,000 families, mostly families of poverty and overwhelmingly families of color in this city, applied for 20,000 charter seats. Now, if you're supposed to be someone who cares about that constituency, the idea that you're going to try to tamp that down seems to me to be an enormous mistake. And so that does worry me. Second thing that worries me, if the signal goes out to the schools that we won't close schools no matter what, well, everybody's going to take a deep breath, sigh of relief, and say we're back to the good old normal days, and that worries me. And then the third thing that worries me is, and I don't want to get locked into letter grades and the imperfections of letter grades, but I sure as hell hope that accountability is a part of the going forward system.
So let's talk about the letter grades just very briefly. Even some of your own senior staff are wondering whether there could be some meaningful changes in ways that would make them continuous but without the letters, and bringing together the quality review with the progress report. And again, just for people who don't know, traditionally the way the schools have been evaluated have essentially been driven
See the
by
jacket on
performance.
Jennifer Rabb, my God.
There we go.
I mean, talk about making an entry.
There we go.
Look at that. That is absolutely spectacular.
So we're talking about grading schools and
So-
whether there's a more effective way of doing it.
Well, there are two points you made. Yes,
Okay.
there are always more effective ways in
Right.
putting other things in, although I don't ignore and I don't apologize for the fact that measuring progress, apples to apples, rather than, Jim Lieberman said it better than anyone. We were trying to figure out what the school brings to the kid, not what the kid brings to the school. So telling me that a gifted and talented program performs at a very high level doesn't give me a whole lot of information. However, I do think there are better ways, and certainly college readiness metrics and taking into account quality reviews. Although, quality reviews, you got to be a little careful, because grade inflation on subjective evaluations is pretty easy. But I still think what people have said, there are better ways to do things, and we made changes, and I would hope nobody wrote these things in tablets. On the other hand, where I do disagree is this notion that we take away the grade. That's exactly what everybody wants, right? I remember when I started, people used to say, you had 320 cinees. So what the hell is a cine? And how do I explain that to the people of the city of New York? They said, well, a cine is a school in need of improvement. So, I mean, with that, if you call those things what they are, which were failing schools, then parents and teachers and others get a message. All schools in New York were in need of improvement. It's embarrassing to call a school that's in need of, tell me one that wasn't in need of improvement. And so I'm a little worried that we're afraid of calling things the way they are because of what I think is the old self-esteem crowd, which is, let's just make everybody feel good. I thought Frank Bruni had a terrific piece in the Times a couple of weeks ago, Sunday, and Bruni's not known as a right-winger or anything like that, but I thought he had a terrific piece on, are we communicating? You take these PISA tests. American kids are always the ones who think they did the best. We've really succeeded at giving them self-confidence. What we haven't succeeded is giving them the skills to justify their self-confidence.
Well, let me push you on that, too. There is a lot of rhetoric about our failing education system, and as you know, there's pushback from folks like Diane Ravitch and Berliner and others saying this is, and I'm quoting, a manufactured crisis. And they point to the fact that we have had for many years the world's most productive economy. And I want to square this once and for all in front of at least this audience, because it's becoming said more and more often. That is, there's this claim that somehow we've got a disastrous education system when in fact we have this massively productive economy, so there's a disconnect.
So great you asked this, because I actually was on a show today with Tom Friedman, who said, I don't worry about America, I worry about Americans. And my response to Tom Friedman was, you start to worry about enough Americans, you're going to better worry about America. So I think, give me a little time to develop, because I think this is a profoundly important issue. America has had the strongest economy in the second half of the 20th century, and even now, although, not so strong. Second of all, we created the greatest middle class the world had ever seen. So we were not only good at baking a big pie, but we were baking a pie in which people got a bigger and bigger slice, became more and more hopeful, and bought into something called the American dream. Indeed, at that point, we didn't have this kind of 99%, 1%, two Americas and all this baloney. We were sort of in this together. And if you read, what's his name up at Harvard, the race between education and technology, Larry Katz and Claudia Golden. If you read that book from the beginning of the 20th century to 1980, In that period of time, America's educational attainment grew at the same pace as technological advancement. From 1980 to 2010, our technological advancement has doubled our educational attainment. And what that means is the top people are doing just fine. The economy is going to be fine. But the people who need jobs and who need pay increases and don't have the skills are not. When I started public school in New York, 60% of the American workforce were high school dropouts. Today, it's about 6% and declining. And we all know there are lots of jobs out there that go unfilled because people don't have the skills. So the people who say the economy will be fine and ignore the fact that our kids won't be fine, and kids who are now in third grade in New York who can't read and are not going to get out of school prepared for higher order complex thinking and all the other things, those kids are going to pay a huge price. So when people say something like, well, these PISA scores don't matter because, I mean, it's embarrassing. People in Vietnam, you know, these are the people who always say, well, poverty is the reason they're not getting it. People in Vietnam are a whole hell of a lot poorer. They spend much, much less money than we do. And they beat us in math by about 20 points in the PISA. And if we think this is a winning formula for building a cohesive society in which for the first time, unlike 20 years ago, the average American feels his kid's life will not be as good as his life was. That's an awfully condemning fact to get your head around. And if we don't think education is the pathway out of that, then I must say I
But you
could
know
not.
what the pushback is. The pushback is, while we're trying to take a small slice of underprivileged kids and give them decent education, the economic structure is pushing us further and further apart. So you're putting on the back of education a dilemma it can't possibly
It's
solve.
not true. We've never had more programs supporting people. I mean, the amount of money the country spends, it's not that we shouldn't spend more, and we shouldn't do more in terms of things like pre-K and other things like that, but it's just not true to say, I mean, the amount of redistribution going on in America may not be enough, but it's higher than it's ever been. It's just not accurate. And what is accurate is that more and more the jobs demanded in a global high-tech economy, we're not preparing our kids for. And these other economies are going to prepare the kids for them. And if we want to just ignore that fact, we can ignore it. But it's not about redistribution. And second of all, it does seem to me, I mean, somebody pointed out today that Shanghai, which, you know, was 2.5 years ahead of Massachusetts. And I don't have to tell you, Massachusetts is way the hell ahead of all the rest of us. 2.5 years ahead. It also turns out that they spend 50 days more each year in school. 50 days over 10 years is about 2.5 years. So we got to get real about this.
So children in charter schools in New York City spend a lot more time in classrooms than they do in the regular public schools.
As it should be.
You don't mean that. You don't mean that there should be a dichotomy.
No, I mean,
Right,
all kids should spend a
right.
whole hell of a
So-
lot more time in school.
So in your multiple conversations with your good friend Michael Mulgrew, what didn't happen? What could have, should have, would have happened that could have helped you make an even greater difference for the non-charter schools?
Oh, millions of things. I mean, we still are tethered to a fundamental trade union model. And you and I and everybody, including the people in the trade union, know that until we professionalize teaching, and I mean professionalize it, I don't mean lockstep and all the seniority, right? I mean, you can't sit here and seriously think that LIFO is an intelligent way. That doesn't mean that people who have more experience don't gain from it.
Automatically.
But these are the kinds of rules that grew up in a trade union model, in an assembly line model, in a coal mine model, in a steel mill model, and we apply it to a profession, and it just does not work. And if we're not serious about treating, and we try to micromanage them, and if we're not serious about empowering teachers, treating them as professionals, and hold them meaningfully accountable, and the problem we have, part of the accountability problem is, which the charter schools don't have, is we have to have one for the whole state. Mm-hmm. So people like you are sitting up there trying, and everybody's sitting back and saying, well, if you do this, it's too much of that. You do this, it's too much of that. And, you know, if you have to have one accountability system, I mean, where I work now, you know, I have my accountability system. It's different from another person. The people at Dow Jones count people different. But once you have to have one because the union insists on one for the whole mess of porridge, it's never going to work. It's going to be always easy to criticize. And so but the alternative is always to give people discretion. And the one thing the unions never want to tolerate is discretion, because discretion then means people can be held accountable. So they want to go to a rule-based model, and then you see what we have right now, which is everybody criticizing this particular rule or that particular rule.
And yet, I can speak now with personal experience, any effort to touch what's called the Tri-Borough Amendment, which is what structures this at the state level, has so far.
And it's not going to happen.
It's not going to happen.
Not going to happen.
Yeah.
No, but
Yep.
the thing works. What I always said is the problem with public education is not that it doesn't work. It just doesn't work for the kids. It works precisely the way it was designed to work. And for people who want certain interests protected, it works remarkably well.
So let's shift gears quickly. One of the things that I think you may have changed your own thinking on, and that is allowed.
Saul Stern's going to be so proud of you sitting
Exactly.
in the front row.
You know what's
Pay on
coming.
to Saul.
Is on this question of content and curriculum. As you know, it's close to my heart. One of the criticisms, not only of what happened here in New York, but one might say generally and nationally, is that we are frightened of content, that we're in love with critical thinking about nothing in particular, that came late in this regime.
Fair criticism. I mean, I've said it. It's right. There was this view which got caught up in the whole progressive. I put together about 3 or 4 things. One is self-esteem. So we would just generate self-esteem, and then kids will become good performers. Second thing was this whole kind of whole language will, read to the kids, and then they'll go home and they'll read and they'll live happily ever after. So this was, in candor, not my background. I was not, if I had known you then and you had coached me early on. And it did strike me over time that the importance of content, of knowledge, and I started to read a lot. And so, it's all, I don't agree with everything that Saul says, but in this area, he wrote some pretty barbed attacks, following on the Massachusetts experiment, where you guys up in Massachusetts did focus much more on a content-based curriculum. And I spent time, and then I actually reached out for Don Hirsch.
Right.
And said to him, Don, this is a deficiency, and I need your help. Yep. And we piloted the thing, and now you look at the Common Core, and the Common Core, the best parts of the Common Core are tethered to core knowledge. Right. And, to see a New York Times article that discusses the resurrection of Hirsch is, to me, phenomenal. And while I wish I got there a lot sooner, I'm sure happy I got there, and I think that's going to have national impact.
Do you worry that the next generation of assessments, and as you know, assessments become the curriculum by default because they're high stakes and teachers rationally teach to them? Do you worry that with all of our sensitivity about not offending this group, that group, or the other group, not deprivileging this student or that student, I was stunned to read that every test question has to go through 6 sensitivity levels and so forth and so on. You can't use the word opera because
lots of people don't know
what
opera
it is, which of course simply rationalizes the fact that they never will. Is there a real risk that one more time we're going to come up with a dumb set of tests and we will lose this reform?
Yes. I mean, it's always a dynamic process, but if we get Common Core, and if Common Core becomes an implementation of the kind of grade, it doesn't have to be literally what Hirsch is talking about. Right. But it's got to be a knowledge-based, your thing before about critical thinking about absolutely nothing. I mean, they used to say to me in meetings, teach kids critical thinking, as if you don't teach them to read and you don't teach them history, and most of the critical thinkers I knew were pretty good at algebra, and the best of them were also okay at calculus. And if you don't teach these knowledge-based things, but we just get them out there and say, think really hard and smart about this stuff, it's going to work. So the answer to your question is, yes, I am concerned about that. I am always concerned about the edu-establishment and political correctness. And if, in fact, they did more of what Don wants and tether these tests to a knowledge-based curriculum so that you reinforce the message, we would be further along.
Yeah, that doesn't look great at this point.
Well, it'll be better than
we
but
have.
not good enough.
Would encourage people to begin to put their own questions to the end of the rows. Let's speak now to the early childhood issue, which has been much spoken of, not just in this city, but as you know, nationally. I'm struck by two facts. One, that it has attracted a great deal of support, I suspect, from the general sense of common sense, right? Doesn't it make sense, given the predictability of third grade results, which are staggering on
Right.
8th and 9th grade results? On the other hand, all the good data I've seen shows that for Head Start, for example, it's been a colossal, I'm going to be very blunt here, a colossal waste of money because the gaps reopen. So as you think back on what you tried to do in the early grade levels and now the national and city discussion about focusing on the early grades, are we going after the right thing? Are we going to waste this moment all over again?
So I'm glad I got killed the other night at dinner when I made the point about Head Start that you just made. I mean, so now I can say, well, Dr. Steiner told me this. People can go after you, but I got killed on this issue. So look, here's what I think. I think, first of all, we shouldn't. It's an easy one, right? Everybody
Right.
says makes
it's
sense.
like being against
right?
apple pie.
Exactly. Second of all, we have these kids now for 13 years. So adding a 14th year in and of itself, if it's the same as the other 13, isn't going to do anything. And the whole issue is the quality of what happened. Head Start became a jobs program and a babysitting program. And once you did that, there was nothing called learning that was going on. You know, I always thought, you think about the vocabulary differential. There's no reason Head Start couldn't help those kids develop greater vocabularies during the time those kids, just like my kid developed vocabulary from her 4th to 5th year. So the answer, which doesn't sound like rocket science, but it'll get sacrificed in politics, the answer is not to be against pre-K. The answer is to be in favor of high-quality pre-K. How do we measure that? If we measure that by every community group that comes forward who knows a politician who wants to run a pre-K program and then gets away with it and says it's high quality because people in the neighborhood listen to a politician and send them there, then we're going to blow it again. Now, on the other hand, if we use that time, one of the most malleable plastic times in a kid's brain between 2 and 5, if we were to use that time, particularly for kids who are struggling at home, to use that to stimulate intelligent discussion and thinking, then I think it could be very beneficial. But what worries me when you hear a whole city or a whole nation go in that direction is that the risk of recapitulating Head Start is enormously high.
And, one question to connect your current work, if I may, with your work as Chancellor. How do you see that bridge? Help us link the work in New York City with what you're trying to do now.
So I guess one of the things that came to me later on as I was Chancellor, a combination of two things. Everybody's so focused on evals and all these other things, fine and dandy. Right. We have a workforce of over 3.2 million teachers in America, and that's going to be our team on the field. And one of the things I thought was, how do we make them better at what they're doing? And quite frankly, how do we engage kids better in what they're doing to make their job easier? So to me, a lot of what I'm trying to do now, whether it is working with core knowledge, whether it is developing digital curricula, using videos to engage kids in learning, helping teachers think. Not every teacher is going to have to try to figure out what are the 3 or 4 really important questions about Frederick Douglass or Tom Sawyer. Using games. We have a game where you literally have a library under siege. And in order to prevail, you have to do more and more reading. I've done enough testing with kids right now to know that this kind of thing reinforces the kind of habits. So I thought there was an opportunity here, and I hope I'm right about that, and we'll see over time. And then the second thing I thought was, there is something about a world like America. I mean, all these people will tell you about, well, America's going to be fine because we have the most innovative, where are the Apples and where are the Amazons and where are the Googles and where are the Facebooks, all in America. But I'll tell you, there's no Apples, Googles, and Facebooks in K-12. I mean, we're still, we have a 19th century, not even a 20th century classroom model. So the idea that we might try and see if innovation can, no guarantee that it will, can. For every great startup in Silicon Valley, there are lots that fall on their back. So that's the combination of things excited me. And it also seemed to me a way forward, because anything we do can only be successful if teachers become proselytizers of it. And for the first time, instead of saying to teachers, well, this is really about which of you aren't going to be here tomorrow, this is something that really may empower them and excite them.
So two last questions. We've got a paradox right now. We want and believe, and some things you've said this evening, speak to this. We want a professional labor force of teachers. We want teachers who can take responsibility for what's going on in their classroom. You gave a lot of empowerment to principals, but teachers are facing this extraordinarily heavy eval system. And at the same time, we're looking at Canada or Finland or wherever and saying, here's a model where teachers are really regarded as professionals and are given deep learning time and can actually plan together. And Finland actually got rid of its accountability system almost immediately because it was losing some of its top teachers who just wouldn't tolerate it. Are we, for political or historical reasons, creating a train wreck here where we're just doing two incompatible things?
I don't know. The problem is when you have a dysfunctional model and
Right.
you try to operate within it. Again, as I said, you know, I assume people who are running charter schools, they do evaluations. You have to. I mean, anybody who works in the real world looks at your workforce and says, you know, these are people who are doing really well. These people I need to help. These people, quite frankly, aren't going to make it. And you know, you want to be as humane as possible about that. But once we start with the state that has, you know, somewhere in the neighborhood of a couple 100,000 teachers, and you're going to try to find one eval system, it just strikes me as you're trying to build on top of something that's poorly foundationalized. If I were to tell everybody in this room to read a speech that I bet most of them haven't read in a long time, it's Al Shanker's 1985 speech on the professionalization of teaching. Now, if you had really bold, energetic, creative teacher leadership, union leadership right now, they would do what Shanker said and precipitate a second revolution. The ed schools would have to get behind it. It would actually be a requirement that in order to, just like in Finland and Canada, in order to get through an ed school, you really have to be somebody who's, if not the top,
Or close.
certainly near the top, right? Rigorous demands in who we bring into the teaching profession, professionalizing them, not trying to micromanage them. I mean, one of the criticisms was, that I thought was also fair, we try to tell them, you know, how long a mini lesson.
Right.
I mean, when I practiced law, if somebody told me how long a mini lesson was, I'd shoot them. Right. So I think that kind of, but the problem is we've got a broken model. As long as we have a trade union, seniority, lockstep pay. I mean, every day, and I said this today, every time I was told when I said, if I pay my phys ed teachers the same as I pay my math teachers, I'm not going to have the right math teachers. Every time I said that.
So accountability is the last best.
You've got to build it in. The trouble is you're building it on the wrong model. On the other hand, you can't ignore it. We can't say that teachers who year after year take their kids in the wrong direction.
Right.
This is not about, you know, we can't say that's just fine and dandy.
Right, but at the same time, we risk losing the best because we're building this thing on a bad
I don't know.
foundation.
You know, the experience that they had in D.C. under Michelle's system, that's been independently evaluated. Doesn't suggest we're losing the best. And if the results they got on NAEP could be replicated elsewhere, we'd all be pretty happy campers right now. 20 points in D.C. is a big damn deal.
And then the last question before we take from the audience. If somebody had been able to give you a piece of advice at the beginning of your chancellorship, which you'd wish you had heard, which will be the position that somebody will face in the next couple of weeks in New York City, what would you have liked to have been told or briefed on or made to understand at the beginning?
I suppose, I mean, we've already discussed this, but I guess what I would have liked to understand is, and Saul could have done this, Don Hirsch could have done this for me, is that the curriculum thing really
But
matters.
nothing about the major thrusts of what you did, nothing on the union or anything. As you look back, there was no particular...
The only thing, you know, Tony Blair said this to Michael Barber, and it strikes me as about right. I mean, the biggest criticism I would say of us and everybody else, we weren't bold enough. I mean, the noise bothers me least of all. When I get up in the morning and think that there are more kids that are having better lives because we were unafraid to break China. When I think to myself, if I hadn't opened up 180 charter schools, those 20,000 parents who got in to places this just recently wouldn't have got in. And if I hadn't done that, and all the price I paid got sued by the unions and the NAACP, I'm pretty happy about that. I'll take that trade-off every single time. So I'm not a big believer in the fact that you need all this immediate sort of poll-driven support. I wasn't running for mayor, and the mayor took care of running for mayor. I was trying to change the lives of kids. And I'll let history take a hard look at what we did.
Great. May I take the questions? Thank you. Thank you. You, from the beginning, said you wanted a system of great schools and not a great school system. Do you still think that we can move the needle on reform by focusing on individual schools?
Yeah, I don't know any other way to figure. You know, everybody, you send your kid to a school. You don't send your kid to a system, right? If my kid, and this is what drives me nuts about choice, I'm a pretty big believer that if it's good enough for the 1%, it should be good enough for the 99%. I don't know anybody in the 1% who doesn't insist on choice for their kids. And the idea that we'd eliminate choice strikes me as nuts. One statistic worth noting, when we started in K-8 schools, New York City had 60% of the bottom quartile on the New York State performance. And we cut that number in half. That's a whole hell of a lot better schools. But I don't know any formula that tells me that the unit that doesn't matter is the school.
Well, let's push it further. What is your position on eliminating the Blaine Amendment to allow real school choice options for New York families?
I would support real choice options. I would.
Including a voucher tax.
And I'm a big believer that choice is something all of us want in every aspect of our lives. And when it comes to schools, it really strikes me is that kids who grow up in high poverty communities are basically told one and done, whereas none of the rest of us. When somebody says to me they send their kid to public school called Stuyvesant, this doesn't seem terribly heroic to me. I mean, maybe I'm wrong about that. But, you know, when somebody tells me that if you're born in the Bronx and you're stuck in a school that none of us, I used to ask this question of people all the time, principals and others, what percentage of my schools would you send your kids to? Most of them would say maybe about 5, 7, 10%. And whose kids should go to the other 90% of those schools? And the answer was others, OPC, other people's children. I don't think so.
Well, let's take the other side of the equation, the constant critique that the charter schools have low percentages of special education students, of ELL students, that they are counseling those students out at very high rates. And in fact, that criticism has been made of some of the highest performing charter schools, as you know.
It's largely not fact-based. I mean, it's a convenient talking point. But the solution to that, and the department actually addressed that, is if you want to set requirements and set standards and say when you can counsel people out as a condition of the charter, sure. But, you know, when Eva Moskowitz got this enormously high results across her network this last go-around, you know, lots of people out there who like to make excuse for the non-performance of the system went to work on this kind of stuff.
On the melt rate.
But it's just ridiculous. I mean, the numbers she's got, you're talking about 82% proficiency in math in a state that's much wider and much wealthier. And that state's got 30% proficiency. And you're talking about 58% proficiency in English in a state that's got 31%. This is a big difference.
There's one further question about preparing teachers, which is obviously something that's close to my heart, and preparing principals. The Principal Leadership Academy, as you know, is extremely expensive, over $200,000 a candidate. I know you and I both have been very critical of ed schools. We have Norman Atkins here in the audience who's worked with us on this. Do we need a very radical rethink?
We need a Flexner report. I've been saying this for a decade. We need a Flexner report.
And yet,
the reason, the economics don't work. Let's be truthful about this. The university's point of view is ed schools are a cash cow. Arnie Duncan had the guts to come up to Columbia and say that. So, number one, basically like much of university, they often work for the benefit of the faculty. So the faculty like to teach things like pedagogy and all this other stuff. Why ed schools don't insist on, we're talking about content, on really requiring people to have much greater content knowledge when they leave. The number of people teaching math who never studied math is shameful. And ed schools ought to be part of the solution. And a Flexner report that said before we stamp a kid as ready to teach, that kid has got to know math, she's got to know history, she's got to know English language, arts, whatever. Instead of saying, well, she's a pedagogical expert.
Well, let's send a joint message to my successor that the cut score on the content test that the state is now putting in be high.
Let's hope so.
let's-
Unlike the current structure where
right, where it's
if you
98%.
if you find a room, you can't fail.
I think part of this is, of course, that we have traditionally split content and pedagogy, because most of the content, particularly for the high school teacher, is coming from an arts and science course, and the ed school is simply teaching the technique.
Exactly.
And that's a bridge or a divide that's wider than 120th Street.
Exactly.
So
And why can't, these are university policies. University can say, you want to come to our ed school, these are the requirements, and then we'll stamp you. And here we're sitting around, everybody's agreeing, we're in heated agreement, and I confessed error about content. And why aren't people beating up on the ed school saying to them, how about teaching your graduates content so that they can teach other people content? And that's a huge problem. When we had, I don't know how many people who would fail the math test 3-4 times, and the passing grade was 60%. And eventually they pass, and then they would end up teaching kids math, and they don't know math. They could be the most wonderful people in the world, David. They can care deeply about the kids, and they may be a wonderful role model, but they still have to know math.
Deep down, though, when we had in the city a full scholarship program for recruiting math teachers, high school math teachers and science teachers, we couldn't find the candidates. And so I think in the long run, it goes back to rethinking the entire profession. It is the professionalism of which we were speaking, and trying to create that professionalism against the backdrop of the structural constraints we also described is keeping us stuck. We need somebody, some force to blow up the system. Otherwise,
Well, I think this has got to be a combination of the unions and the ed schools. I think they have got to come together and say, you know, we want to create a different paradigm and get it done. I mean, again, if you read Shanker's piece, it's so powerful, and it's now, what, 30 years? It's just extraordinary.
Well, I want to thank you very, very much for all of your
thank you.
comments, and more importantly, for the work you did.
Well, thank you very much. And let me thank you for the work you did. And again, I want to say this is really, for me, at the end of the 12 years of the Bloomberg administration, see people like Eddie I haven't seen literally in 10 years, who was then at Merrill Lynch and one of our really strong supporters and bringing a lot of philanthropy. I couldn't say enough about Michelle. I mean, what I learned from her, one of the mistakes I didn't make was to bring her on early on, and what I learned from her has been truly extraordinary. Chris Cerf, who used to work for me, now I work for him. He's moved on to, I mean, it's just an extraordinary group of people in the room. Veronica Conformi, I mean, people that have really, and continue to fight for the kids. And one message I would leave you: mayors come and go. The kids in New York will be here forever. And those of you who are engaged and involved, stay engaged and stay involved and fight for kids. Just like schools are one at a time, kids are one at a time. And when you change a life, I'll tell you, it's greater reward than all the riches a person could find. So keep at it.
Thank you so much.
So,
Thank you so much.